He asked to sweep the cafe floor for soup. Then the billionaire realized who he was. Welcome back to our amazing storytelling channel. Before we dive into today's incredible and heart-wrenching story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest content. We absolutely love hearing from our global audience, so please drop a comment below and tell us which city or country you're watching from. Your support and engagement mean everything to us and help us continue bringing you these powerful stories. Now, let's begin this remarkable tale of pride, fall from grace, and unexpected recognition that will remind you how quickly life can change and how our past connections can resurface in the most surprising ways. The autumn rain hammered against the windows of Meridian Café as David Chen wiped down the espresso machine for the third time that evening. At 45 Das, he had built a small empire of high-end coffee shops across Manhattan, but this particular location in the financial district held special meaning. It was his first, the one he had opened 15 years ago with nothing but determination and a business loan that had terrified him. Now, as one of New York's most successful restaurateurs with a net worth approaching 9 figures, David still came to this original cafe every Tuesday evening, partly out of nostalgia and partly because the routine kept him grounded. The dinner rush had ended an hour ago, and only a few customers remained scattered across the warm, honey-lit space, nursing their laptops and late-night lattes. David was considering closing early when the front door chimed, bringing with it a gust of cold air and the figure of a man who looked like he had been fighting the weather for far longer than just this evening. The stranger stood in the doorway for a moment, water dripping from his threadbare coat onto the polished hardwood floors. His hair, once probably brown, was now streaked with premature grey and hung limp around a face that spoke of recent hardship. The clothes he wore, a faded dress shirt with a frayed collar, pants that had seen better decades, and shoes that were more holes than leather, told a story of circumstances that had spiraled far beyond his control. David watched as the man's eyes scanned the cafe, taking in the warm lighting, the displays of artisanal pastries, and the prices on the menu board that probably represented more money than he had seen in weeks. There was something about his posture that suggested he was fighting an internal battle between desperation and dignity was losing. After what seemed like an eternity, the man approached the counter where David was standing. Up close, David could see the hunger in his eyes, not just the physical hunger that came from missed meals, but the deeper hunger of someone who had lost his place in the world and was struggling to find a way back. Excuse me, the man said, his voice hoarse but educated, carrying the accent of someone who had once moved in circles where such things mattered. I know this is an unusual request, but I was wondering if I could sweep your floors or wash some dishes in exchange for a bowl of soup. I haven't eaten in 2 days, and I'm willing to work for whatever you can spare. David felt something twist in his chest at the man's words. He had been fortunate in business, but he remembered the early days when every dollar mattered, when the difference between success and failure could be measured in the cost of a single meal. But there was something else about this interaction that bothered him, something familiar about the man's voice and the way he carried himself, even in his current reduced circumstances. "We don't really have a soup menu," David replied, trying to buy himself time to process what he was seeing. "This is more of a coffee and pastry place." The man's face fell slightly, but he didn't move away from the counter. "Anything warm would be appreciated. I could clean the bathroom, organize your storage room, whatever needs doing. I'm not looking for charity. I want to earn whatever you can give me." David studied the man more carefully, noting the way he spoke, the grammatical precision that suggested education, and something else that was nagging at the edge of his memory. There was something about the shape of his face, the set of his shoulders, that seemed to connect to a place in David's past that he couldn't quite access. "What's your name?" David asked, though he wasn't sure why the question felt so important. "Robert," the man replied. "Robert Hamilton." The name hit David like a physical blow, and suddenly the familiar features clicked into place with devastating clarity. Robert Hamilton, Bobby Hamilton from Columbia Business School, the golden boy who had graduated summa cum laude, who had been recruited by Goldman Sachs before graduation, who had been destined for Wall Street greatness, while David was still figuring out how to make decent espresso. Bobby Hamilton, who had once told David at a business school networking event that small businesses like coffee shops were for people who lacked the vision and intelligence to play in the real financial markets. David stared at the man before him, his mind struggling to reconcile the hungry stranger asking to sweep floors with the arrogant, immaculately dressed classmate who had once looked down on him with barely concealed contempt. Bobby Hamilton had been everything David wasn't in business school, privileged, connected, and absolutely certain that his path to wealth and success was not only inevitable, but superior to everyone else's more modest ambitions. "Bobby," David said quietly, the name feeling strange on his lips after 15 years. Robert's eyes widened in recognition and something that looked like shame. He took a half-step backward, as if he might flee back into the rainy night rather than face this particular moment of reckoning. "David Chen," Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize this was your place." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of years and circumstances that neither man could have predicted when they last saw each other at their business school graduation. David remembered that day clearly, Bobby accepting an award for academic excellence, while David quietly celebrated landing his first job as an assistant manager at a small cafe in Brooklyn. "I read about your success," Robert continued, his voice gaining strength as he forced himself to meet David's eyes. "The restaurant empire, the James Beard nominations, the write-ups in Forbes. You've done incredibly well for yourself." David felt a complex mixture of emotions swirling in his chest. There was satisfaction, certainly, a vindication of the path he had chosen, despite Bobby's dismissive comments about small business being beneath their shared MBA education. But more than that, there was genuine shock at how completely their positions had reversed, and beneath that, something that might have been compassion. "What happened, Bobby?" David asked, then immediately regretted the directness of the question. "I mean, you don't have to—" "It's okay," Robert interrupted, straightening his shoulders in a gesture that reminded David of the confident young man he had once been. "So I suppose if I'm going to ask you for work sweeping floors, I owe you some explanation." Robert looked around the cafe, noting that the few remaining customers were absorbed in their own activities and unlikely to overhear their conversation. "The short version is that I got everything I thought I wanted," Robert began. "The Goldman Sachs job led to a hedge fund position, which led to starting my own investment firm. By the time I was 35, I was managing $2 billion in assets and living in a penthouse that cost more per month than most people make in a year." David waited, sensing that this story was heading somewhere darker than simple success. "I got overconfident," Robert continued, "started making increasingly risky bets, convinced that I was smarter than the market, that the rules that applied to other people didn't apply to me. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, I doubled down instead of cutting losses. I was certain that my analysis was correct and that the market would bounce back quickly." Robert's voice took on the hollow quality of someone recounting a disaster they had witnessed from the inside. "I lost everything, not just my own money, but my clients' money, pension funds, retirement accounts, college savings. Gone. The lawsuits came fast and hard. I lost my apartment, my car, my reputation. Most of my friends disappeared the moment it became clear that I wasn't going to bounce back quickly." David felt his anger at Bobby's past arrogance beginning to fade, replaced by something closer to sympathy. He had read about cases like this during the financial crisis. Brilliant, successful people who had made catastrophic miscalculations and lost not just their wealth but their entire sense of identity. "I've been trying to rebuild for 6 years," Robert continued. "But once you've been involved in that kind of financial scandal, doors don't open easily. I've had jobs, consulting work, temporary positions, but nothing stable, nothing that pays enough to get ahead. The past month has been particularly rough. I've been staying in shelters when there's space, sleeping rough when there isn't." Robert gestured toward his worn clothing with a self-deprecating smile that held no trace of his former arrogance. "So here I am, asking my former classmate if I can sweep his floors for a meal. I imagine there's some poetic justice in that, given some of the things I said to you back in school." David remembered those comments clearly, Bobby's dismissive remarks about small business, his certainty that people who opened coffee shops were settling for mediocrity, his assumption that financial success was a simple matter of intelligence and proper education. But looking at Robert now, hungry and humble, David felt no satisfaction in being proven right. Instead, he felt something he hadn't expected: respect for the man's willingness to work for what he needed, even when that work came with the humiliation of asking help from someone he had once condescended to. David stood behind his espresso machine, watching Robert Hamilton shift uncomfortably in his worn shoes, and made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of offering the floor-sweeping job that Robert had requested, David walked around the counter and flipped the sign on the front door from open to closed. "The floors can wait," David said, gesturing toward one of the comfortable armchairs near the window. "But I think you should sit down and let me make you something to eat." Robert's face flushed with what looked like a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "I meant what I said about working for it. I don't want charity." "It's not charity," David replied, already moving toward the kitchen area behind the counter. "Consider it a business meeting. I actually have a proposition for you, but first, you need food and we both need coffee." David busied himself preparing a substantial meal from the Café's offerings: a grilled panini, a bowl of the butternut squash soup they served as a seasonal special, and a side of roasted vegetables that were left over from the dinner service. As he worked, he found himself thinking about the strange turns that both their lives had taken since business school. When he returned to the seating area with the food and 2 cups of his best Colombian blend, David found Robert staring out the rain-streaked window with an expression that suggested he was still processing the surreal nature of their encounter. "Eat first," David said, settling into the chair across from Robert. "We can talk after you've gotten some food in you." David watched as Robert took his first bite of the panini, closing his eyes briefly in what appeared to be genuine relief. It occurred to David that he hadn't really thought about hunger, real, physical hunger, in over a decade. His success had insulated him from that particular desperation, and seeing it in someone he had once known well was both humbling and motivating. "This is incredible," Robert said after finishing nearly half the sandwich in silence. "I'd forgotten what real food tastes like." "I'm glad you like it," David replied. "The chef here trained at Culinary Institute of America. I've always believed that good food should be accessible, but that accessible doesn't have to mean compromising on quality." Robert nodded, seeming to savor not just the food, but the simple pleasure of sitting in a warm, safe space with no immediate pressures or demands on his time. "You mentioned a proposition," Robert said after he had made significant progress on the meal. David had been thinking about this while he prepared the food, weighing the risks and potential benefits of what he was considering. "I need someone to help me with a new project," David began. "I'm opening 3 new locations over the next 6 months, and I need someone with serious business experience to help with the financial planning, market analysis, and operational efficiency studies. The work would involve everything from site selection to supply chain optimization." Robert looked up from his soup, clearly intrigued, but also skeptical. "David, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but my reputation in the financial world is complicated. Hiring me could reflect poorly on your business." "Let me worry about my business reputation," David replied. "The question is whether you're interested in the work itself. It would be legitimate consulting work at market rates, with the possibility of a permanent position if things work out well." Robert set down his spoon and studied David's face, as if trying to determine whether this offer was genuine or some elaborate form of pity. "Why?" Robert asked finally. "After everything that happened between us in school, after what I said about your ambitions, why would you want to help me?" David considered this question carefully. The honest answer was complicated, involving his own memories of struggling to be taken seriously in business school, his belief that everyone deserved a second chance, and his recognition that Robert's fall from grace had probably taught him lessons about humility and resilience that no business school could provide. "Because I think you've learned things in the past 6 years that make you more valuable, not less," David said finally. "Failure is a better teacher than success, and someone who's lost everything and is still willing to work for a meal has a different perspective on risk and value than someone who's never really been tested." Robert was quiet for a long moment, finishing his soup while he processed David's words. "I won't pretend I'm not desperate," Robert said eventually. "But I also won't pretend that working for you wouldn't be complicated for both of us. There's history here, and not all of it is pleasant." "Then let's make new history," David suggested. "Starting with you finishing that meal and then coming back tomorrow morning to look at some site surveys and financial projections. We can figure out the rest as we go." The next morning, Robert Hamilton stood outside Meridian Café at exactly 8 a.m., wearing the same clothes he had worn the night before, but with an effort made to clean them as best he could in the shelter's bathroom sink. He had spent most of the sleepless night questioning whether David's offer was real, whether he was setting himself up for another devastating disappointment, and whether he had the emotional strength to work alongside someone who had witnessed his fall from grace so completely. David arrived 10 minutes later, carrying a leather briefcase and looking every inch the successful businessman he had become. But when he saw Robert waiting by the door, his greeting was warm and professional, with no trace of the awkwardness Robert had been dreading. "Good morning," David said, unlocking the cafe's front door. "I hope you like strong coffee, because we're going to need it. I've got 3 potential sites to review, and the numbers on all of them are more complicated than I'd like." Inside, David led Robert to a back office that Robert hadn't noticed the night before, a compact but well-organized space with floor-to-ceiling windows, a large desk covered with architectural plans and financial documents, and 2 comfortable chairs positioned to encourage collaboration rather than hierarchy. "Before we start," David said, settling behind his desk, "I want to address something that I think we both need to acknowledge. What happened between us in business school was 15 years ago. We were different people then, with different pressures and different perspectives. I'm not interested in relitigating the past, and I hope you're not either." Robert felt some of the tension he had been carrying since the previous evening begin to ease. "I've thought about those conversations many times over the past few years," Robert admitted, "especially when I was at my lowest point. I was arrogant and dismissive, and I'm sorry for that. I had no right to judge your choices or suggest that your ambitions were somehow less valuable than mine." David waved away the apology with a gesture that suggested he had long since moved past any hurt feelings. "We were both trying to figure out our place in the world," David said. "The difference is that you were more certain about yours than I was about mine. As it turns out, certainty isn't always an advantage." David spread the site surveys across his desk, and Robert found himself leaning forward with genuine interest. The potential locations were in diverse neighborhoods, one in Brooklyn, one in Queens, and one on the Upper West Side, each with different demographic profiles and competitive landscapes. "The Brooklyn location has the best foot traffic and the lowest rent," David explained. "But the neighborhood is gentrifying rapidly, which means the community dynamics are unstable. The Queens spot has great demographics, but requires significant renovation costs. The Upper West Side location is turnkey but expensive, with established competition nearby." Robert studied the financial projections for each location, and for the first time in months, he felt his analytical mind engaging with material that matched his education and experience. Despite everything that had happened to him, he still knew how to read market data, still understood the subtle relationships between location, pricing, and profitability that could make or break a retail business. "Have you considered the impact of the new subway expansion on the Brooklyn location?" Robert asked, pointing to a demographic projection that caught his attention. "The Q line extension is supposed to be completed next year, which could significantly change the commuter patterns in that area." David looked at the documents more carefully, clearly impressed that Robert had noticed a factor that the consulting firm had missed. "I hadn't factored that in," David admitted. "How do you think it would affect the business?" Robert spent the next 20 minutes walking David through a revised analysis that took into account the transportation improvements, the likely changes in foot traffic patterns, and the probability that increased accessibility would accelerate gentrification in ways that could both help and hurt a new business. As they worked together, Robert felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of using his skills to solve real problems, of contributing meaningfully to decisions that would affect people's lives and livelihoods. David, for his part, found himself genuinely impressed by Robert's insights and grateful for the fresh perspective he brought to challenges that David had been wrestling with for weeks. "This is exactly the kind of analysis I needed," David said as they finished reviewing the third location. "You've identified issues and opportunities that I completely missed." Robert felt a flush of pride that was immediately followed by a wave of uncertainty about what this meant for his future. "David, I need you to know that I'm grateful for this opportunity, but I also need to be realistic about my situation. I don't have an address, I don't have appropriate clothes for client meetings, and my credit is destroyed. I'm not sure how sustainable this arrangement can be, no matter how much I want it to work." David leaned back in his chair, clearly considering Robert's concerns. "Those are all solvable problems," David said finally. "Boss, what I need to know is whether you want to solve them, or whether you're looking for reasons why this won't work." Robert stared at David across the desk, realizing that his former classmate was asking him to make a choice that went far beyond accepting a consulting job. David was asking him to decide whether he was ready to rebuild his life, or whether he had become too comfortable with the identity of someone who had failed. "I want to solve them," Robert said quietly. "I've spent the last 2 years convinced that I was paying for my mistakes, and that I deserved whatever hardship came my way. But I think I've been confusing consequences with penance. I made catastrophic errors in judgment, and people suffered because of my decisions. But continuing to suffer myself doesn't undo that damage. It just wastes whatever potential I might have left to do something positive." David nodded, clearly understanding the distinction Robert was making. "Then here's what I propose," David said, pulling a legal pad from his desk drawer. "I need a business consultant for the next 6 months, minimum. The pay is $75,000. With the possibility of a permanent position and equity stake if we work well together. I'll advance you enough money to get an apartment and appropriate clothes, which you can pay back from your salary over time." Robert felt his throat tighten with emotions he had been suppressing for months. "There's one more thing," David continued. "I want you to know that this isn't charity, and it's not me trying to prove some point about forgiveness or second chances. I'm offering you this job because I believe you can do it well, and because my business will benefit from your experience. The fact that you've been through failure might actually make you better at this work, not worse." Robert considered David's words carefully. There was something powerfully healing about being offered work based on his abilities rather than his circumstances, about being seen as someone with value to contribute rather than someone who needed to be rescued. "I accept," Robert said, extending his hand across the desk. As they shook hands, Robert felt something shift inside himself, not the desperate gratitude of someone accepting charity, but the quiet confidence of someone agreeing to a fair exchange of value. Over the next 2 hours, they worked out the practical details of Robert's new position. David gave him an advance on his salary and the address of a furnished apartment in Queens that David had been using for visiting business associates. Robert would start officially on Monday, which gave him the weekend to get situated and purchase appropriate clothing. As they prepared to leave the cafe, David paused at the front door. "Robert, there's something else I want you to know," David said. "What you did last night, asking to work for food instead of just asking for money, that told me something about your character that your business school grades never could have. A lot of people who lose everything become bitter or entitled. You became humble and willing to work. That's why I knew I wanted to hire you." Robert felt tears forming in his eyes, but for the first time in years, they were tears of hope rather than despair. "Thank you," Robert said simply, "for seeing something in me that I'd forgotten was there." 6 months later, Robert Hamilton stood in the newly opened Brooklyn location of Meridian Café, watching the morning rush of customers who had already made the space part of their daily routine. The subway expansion had indeed transformed the neighborhood, exactly as he had predicted, and the cafe was exceeding all profit projections. David approached from behind the counter, holding 2 cups of coffee, and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose business instincts had been proven correct. "Any regrets about turning down that job offer from the consulting firm?" David asked, referring to a position Robert had been offered 3 weeks earlier by a major business consulting company that had been impressed by his work on the cafe expansion. "None," Robert replied, accepting his coffee. "See, I spent 15 years chasing someone else's definition of success, and it nearly destroyed me. I'd rather build something meaningful with someone I trust than chase another prestigious title with people I don't know." David smiled, remembering the arrogant young man from business school who'd been so certain that big financial firms were the only path to real success. "Besides," Robert continued, looking around the thriving cafe, "I've learned that there's profound satisfaction in work that connects directly to people's daily lives. Every cup of coffee we serve, every interaction with customers, every decision we make affects real people in immediate ways." Immediate? I never understood that when I was moving abstract numbers around on computer screens. David nodded, thinking about how both their definitions of success had evolved since their business school days. "You know what the best part is," David said, watching Robert interact with a customer who had a question about the morning pastries. "Tati, I think we both finally figured out what we actually wanted to do with our lives, instead of what we thought we were supposed to want." Robert Hamilton, former Wall Street golden boy, current Café co-owner, and living proof that second chances can lead to better choices, smiled as he helped plan the day's operations for a business that measured success not just in profits, but in the daily satisfaction of work well done and community well served. The end.